Hello, everyone, and welcome to our panel, the last panel of the day. Uh, um, Hello to those joining us on YouTube through our YouTube channel. Today, we have a very interesting panel on narratives to rethink the relationship between nature and human beings. We have our three panelists. We'll talk each of them 20 minutes before taking the question or going to the QA session. So first of all, we have Miguel Ángel Hernández Acosta, who is a PhD in literature from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM. It's easier to say UNAM. He has been included in 10 anthologies of literary criticism and fiction in Mexico, Chile, Venezuela, and Belgium. He has participated in congresses on literature and journalism in Colombia, Ecuador, the United States, and Mexico. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Instituto de Investigaciones Filológicas of the UNAM. Our second panelist is Baron Glanvill. He is a PhD candidate in literary and cultural studies at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His research focuses on African literatures with a particular emphasis on literary form and post-colonial eco-criticism. His dissertation, titled Safari Form, Contesting the Cultural Imagination of Wildlife Conservation in Southern African Literary Representation, which is expected in 2026. He explores Southern African texts that reimagine human-wildlife encounters, moving beyond the traditional framework of the imperial safari romance. He is especially interested in how literary form, post-coloniality, and concept of conservation intersect in these works. And finally, our last panelist, our third panelist, Irene Coletto. I'm pronouncing it somehow in French, Irene Coletto, is a research fellow at the Department of Electrical Energy and Information Engineering within the Marconi Institute for Creativity. The topic of her research is futures and foresight and creativity. Since 2018, she has been involved in activities related to such topics. She is also a graphic facilitator. Her research interests are particularly focused on the application of visual representation to strategic forecasting methodologies and the future of work. NGFP Fellow in 2021. So I just introduced our panelists so that we have the time to listen to them fluently. So we'll start with Miguel Ángel, and Miguel, you have the floor.
Thanks, Louis, for the introduce. Hello, everyone. First, I want to apologize for my English, but I'm going to try a good read. So I'm going to start. I'm shared screen. Okay. Abya Yala is a word adopted as an alternative way of referring to American word imposed on this continent by colonialism. From Patagonia to Alaska, indigenous peoples have attempted forms of resistance against individualism, capitalism, and liberal democracy. By forming a community, they struggle to define themselves as heterogeneous identities who are concerned about the balance of their natural environment, as well as the community organization efforts that allow them to face the environment of westernized world. In April 2019, the Revista de la Universidad de México from Now On magazine of the University of Mexico, dependent on the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, published an issue dedicated to Abya Yala. With it, it proposed giving voice to the indigenous people of the region and invited its readers to listen to what those who have been silenced for so many centuries had to say. To this purpose, the writer and the director of the publication, Guadalupe Nettel, noted in the editorial of the issue that they would not consider anthropologists who turn these people into a curious subject of study. Instead, they would turn to activists, poets, sociologists, and members of this community to hear their versions. The selection of authors, as well as the layout of the issue of the magazine, allow us to appreciate the imaginary that the magazine proposed about Abya Yala. At the same time, the issue as a final work makes it possible to glimpse how Abya Yala is conceived from the pages of a cultural and university magazine, in a certain way elitist, whose readership is above all academic. This work aims to analyze this issue of the magazine of the University of Mexico to find out if, when dealing with this topic, it doesn't not fall into the same thing that it denounced, turning Abya Yala into a curious object of study. As a cultural publication that takes out different literary traditions, mostly far from Central Europe, and with a liberal and progressive tone, it is considered appropriate to analyze the imaginaries created by the contents of the magazine to analyze the coherence of what it states and an editorial line and what it shows through its pages. This will allow us to know whether the contemporary cultural publications, such as the magazine of the University of Mexico, reproduce or not the hegemonic ways of visualizing the indigenous people, in this case from Abya Yala. The magazine of the University of Mexico was first published in 1930 with the aim of disseminating the work of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the most important academic institution in the country. In almost 100 years of existence, it has positioned itself as a publication of relevance for the Latin American cultural and literary field. For example, literary authors belonging to the so-called Latin American boom have published in it, as well as the great thinkers of the continent and authors of the world renown. For example, the Nobel Prize winners Thomas Tranströmer, Mo Yan, Herta Müller, or Simius Hini. Many of the canonical authors of America have been trained in his pages, such as Carlos Fuentes, Carlos Monsiváis, or José Emilio Pacheco, to mention only 3 Mexicans. Each of the stages that it has experienced at the hands of its different directors has been characterized by a particular approach both in the design and in its content. In the period that corresponds to us from 2017 to 2024, under the direction of the writer Guadalupe Nettel, it was characterized by a textual and material renewal of the magazine. After 13 years under the direction of the writer Ignacio Solares, who favored academic and literary essays, Nettel proposed a change that favored the inclusion of young but recognized collaborators in their fields of influence, resort to genres as varied as chronicles or comics, in addition to essays, articles, narrative, criticism, poetry, infographics, or maps, among others, and established that each issue will revolve around a single theme dossier, accompanied by an art section, thematic columns, as well as a criticism section. In addition, Nettel transformed the materiality of the magazine, reduced its size to a book format, changed the type of paper on which it's printed, and changed the design and art included in the magazine. Although there is no target audience defined by the magazine itself, in 2018 interview, the director mentioned university students, due to the language used in the content between academic and popular, it can be thought that it's focused on the university community made of the students as well as researchers and professors at UNAM. The publication has a printed edition, a digital and free edition, as well as 2 platforms in which it continues the debate established by the printed edition, a television program and a radio program. The topics that have been addressed throughout this period refer to political and social aspects from a liberal tone and with ideas considered progressive. Although they are not guided by a current agenda, they are current issues such as feminism, climate emergency, racism, drugs, fascism, exodus, disability, inequality, community, or Abya Yala. The review of these topics allows us to understand the type of public to which the publication is directed, as well as the place in which it seeks to position itself within the Mexican cultural field. We must add that the authors of the magazine are in the great majority Mexican, but North American, Spaniards, and Argentines are also privileged, who represent the fundamental editorial markets for the Spanish edition, although it has a constant presence of writers from practically all Latin America and Europe. This refers to the fact that the tradition from which it draws are not restricted to Eurocentric. Finally, at this stage, there is a greater presence of female authors, as well as interest in the design of art of the magazine. It should be noted that in April 2024, Guadalupe Nettel was involved in a controversy on social networks due to allegations of workplace harassment during her direction, and that in May of this year, she left the magazine because, according to a statement, she was chosen by Columbia University to carry out a writing residency at that institution. To analyze issue 847, published in April 2019, corresponding to the dossier of Abya Yala, we propose a reading in two ways. On the one hand, the content of the text included, and on the other hand, the design and editorial line that can be perceived throughout the pages. The textual parts begin with three epigraphies that open this issue and that give an idea of how Abya Yala is intended to be visualized. The first of them, by Samir Flores Soberanes, a Mexican indigenous activist, says, quote, "Raise your eyes, take your hand, and raise your voice," end of the quote. That is an attitude of resistance and struggle like the one experienced by the native communities of the region. Added to this is one of the American indigenous activists, Leonard Peltier, who says, quote, "We all start innocent, we all become guilty," end of the quote, and refers to the criminalization of the defenders of the native land, like Peltier himself. The last of the epigraphs shows the philosophy of the people of Abya Yala, through a proverb from the north of the region, according to which the first obligation of human beings is to respect and live in harmony with Mother Earth. Quote, "Treat the earth well. It was not given to you by your parents. It was entrusted to you by your children. We did not inherit the land from our ancestors. It is lent up to us by our descendants," end of the quote. The editorial article by Guadalupe Nettel then questions how the idea of modernity and progress has rendered the inhabitants of Abya Yala invisible and has turned them into an object of study, but not into beings with their own voice. The fact of not agreeing on a way to call the inhabitants of these lands, ethnic group, indigenous people, native peoples, means ignoring their individuality and referring their existence to an artificial collectivity. Indigenous people, as if there were no differences between them. For this reason, Nettel points out the objective of the magazine is to offer its page as a space for dialogue between intellectuals, activists, and indigenous poets of our continent, to discover the inhabitants of Abya Yala from their own expression, their desires, and their hopes. After the editorial article, a map is displayed on two pages where Abya Yala and the different regions that comprise it can be seen. In this sense, it is noteworthy that the territory is shown horizontally, emphasizing that from this perspective, there is no north and south, nor a relationship of subordination, but the various ethnic groups are interdependent and interrelated, since they share a philosophy regarding this community that recognizes Mother Earth as a source of life. After this context, the dossier is made up of 21 texts, including articles, interviews, poems, and stories that refer to the condition of inhabitants of Abya Yala, their demands, their way of looking at life, and the claims for which they fight. Also included the proposal for a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth, written in Cochabamba, Bolivia, on 2010, and the text Simple Nazas, signed by Process of Liberation of Mother Earth, a Colombian movement that points out the importance of naming indigenous people according to how they recognize themselves, because power is exercised through the way they write, speak, and name. Quote, "From nonsense to Indians, from Indians to entrusted, to protected, to Colombians, to minors, to civilized, to citizen, to exploited, to excluded, to exterminated. It is the manifest destiny that the West grant us," end of the quote. The dossier shows the acts of resistance that the indigenous people have carried out, the way in which they have been used by the hegemonic system to legitimize themselves through the simple legal recognition, the exoticization and commercialization that their customs and tradition have suffered, the lack of understanding of their forms of communal organization, as well as the interest of this population in finding an identity by differentiate themselves from the rest. Likewise, the art section includes a photographic exhibition by Josué Rivas, an Otomi artist who covered the Standing Rock indigenous movement from a contemporary indigenous perspective, far removed from anthropological stereotypes. It should be noted that of the total numbers of authors in the dossiers, all belong to an indigenous community, except for 5 who are academics or writers without a direct relationship with this ethnic group. Thus, there are representatives of Mixe, Maya, Tzotzil, Hulhuicasa, Chihua, Chontal, Mixtec, Mapuche, Zoque, and Yul communities. In addition, of the 170 pages that make up the issue, 132 are related to the topic of the dossier. Lastly, the illustration of the issue, which covers from the front and back cover, is by indigenous artists from the Colombian Amazon, Abel Rodriguez Muinane. In summary, the content of the magazine responds to what Guadalupe Netter proposed in the editorial and tries to change the way of perceiving these peoples by knowing their versions, their demands, their proposals, their poetry. Thus, when the readers know this philosophy and reflects on them, he will also be able to share them. I quote, "Perhaps you will discover that among their desires and hopes, there are many that you would also strive to." End of the quote. Now, the selection of authors is the responsibility of the director, not the content of the text, which responds entirely to the beliefs and ideologies of the authors. Thus, performing analysis of these issues based only on its content is incomplete. In this regard, the director establishes a textual discourse throughout the magazine. So the arrangement of the text, the inclusion of paratext and highlights manifest the editorial line of the publication. To illustrate, it is not gratuitous that the dossier begins with a map of Abya Yala or the orientation in which it's presented. Similarly, each of the texts participates in a narrative that begins with the text prophets, which speak of the brotherhood between this community, and continues with the declaration of principles that constitutes the poem "And Nobody See Us" by the Guatemalan poet Humberto Cabal. Quote, "And here we are, standing on the side of the roads, with our gaze broken by tear, and nobody see us." End of the quote. It is also worth noting that after several texts that point out the struggles of the peoples of Abya Yala, the last one in the dossier points to the autonomy of indigenous people of Mexico. Throughout the issue, it seems that a discourse is being put forward whose programmatic intention is to show a conflict, what has been done to confront it, and a possible solution. In this sense, the conclusion to this problem lies in the last sentence of the final article of the dossier by Francisco López Bárcenas, quote, "These are long and difficult processes whose first fruits can be seen in the short term, although their consolidation requires much more time." End of the quote. On the other hand, the visual discourse of layout is also an intellectual responsibility and indicates the editorial line. At this point, specificities arise that problematize what has been said so far. For example, the poem in Quiché by Cabal is presented in its original language and in Spanish, but the Spanish version is the first that the reader can access. It can be argued that this is because the reader of the magazine is a Spanish speaker, but if the aim is to privilege the voice of the natives of Abya Yala and the poem is published bilingually, why privilege Spanish? Later in the issue, four more poems are presented, 2 in Tzotzil, another in Chontal, and 1 more in Zoque. The layout privileges Spanish, then the indigenous language, and at the end, a QR code is included that refers to the web edition of the magazine, where the poem can be heard in this original language. Does it respond to an editorial line to privilege the Spanish-speaking reader and target audience of the publication? Is there a subordination of one language to another in this gesture? The temptation to overinterpret in this case is great. Therefore, it is necessary to turn to the graphic part of the magazine and question whether the images included show the particular differences of Abya Yala with respect to Western vision. With the exception of the interview with Patricia Hualinga, defender of the human rights of the Quichua people in the Ecuadorian Amazon, whose title is "Good Living and the Living Jungle," and the article "The Prohibition of Social Life by Candice Hopkins, who points out how indigenous people and their customs are seen as museum oddities. The images in the issue show the inhabitants of Abya Yala as members of a modernity where their customs and uses are, as members of a modernity where their customs and uses are integrated into the world. In the highlighted cases, on the contrary, there is an aestheticization of these communities and a exoticization of them based on seeking a context in which their difference is what allows us to distinguish them. As Edward Said points out, it is trying to find in these images the colonial vision of the East, in this case of Abya Yala, the so-called noble savage surrounded by an overflowing nature that is pleasing to the Western eye. In this regard, it is important that one of the questions that the editorial board of the magazine of the University of Mexico asked Patricia Wallinga seeks confirmation of progressive or political discourse. Quote, perhaps it is convenient to live under the concept that what you have is enough, that you use to the source that you really need and no more. Because within this accumulation of goods that you mentioned, we also have a disproportionate inequality in the world today. There are many people who accumulate things and other people who are dying of hunger. So in some way, there must be some reflection of the moderation of the things we use, of what we can really accumulate and what we cannot, so that everything remains in balance with the resources that Mother Nature gives us. We must note, end on the quote. We must know the appropriation of the phrase, the resources that Mother Nature gives us. Based on the above, what kind of Abya Yala does the magazine of the University of Mexico show? It is possible to explore these themes and not show a colonialist vision as a university publication belonging to the hegemonic culture with a direction like Netel. Finally, let us look at the cover image, Nature Tree by Abel Rodriguez. Does it represent the enormous reality that, according to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, was what attracted Europe's attention? Isn't it true that by getting to know and confirming our prejudice about indigenous community, we can clear our conscience, turn the page, and forget about Abya Yala because we are now aware of these problems? Furthermore, how can we analyze this number without resorting to Western hegemonic methods of analysis? Issue 847 of the magazine of the University of Mexico asks on its cover, quote, what are the current forms of political and cultural resistance of the indigenous people of America? Is it possible to speak on the end of colonialism? Is there a name that groups together the struggle sustains on the continent? What do indigenous movements have to do with climate change? End of the quote. And in this question, perhaps lies the greatest of legends to the magazine, since its answer continues to mark the exceptionality and the rarity of Abya Yala and not its participation in the daily life of those who inhabit and share the territory. However, the editorial intention of the magazine of the University of Mexico can be appreciated in the origin of the authors selected to participate in this issue and in the attempt to show the poems in their language of origin. The result caters to the publication audience, and in that sense, joins a discourse that confronts the hegemonic power of westernized culture that would only have been interested in writing, speaking, and naming in Spanish. Although this issue of the magazine shows the culture of Abya Yala, it does not stop at the prevailing imaginary about these communities, since in the discourse it tries to integrate a native vocabulary, recognizes characters within these native peoples, and even worries that the images of the most of the magazine do not reinforce the stereotypes about that reality. The fact of delegitimizing the academic or anthropological discourse as the only valid one for an approach to Abya Yala is already a rupture. For the above, we consider that the magazine of the University of Mexico in this issue makes an anemic rather than ethical approach to this region, and in doing so goes beyond its guidelines, thereby destroying westernized imaginary and examining this indigenous philosophy without restoring to Western paternalism or colonialism. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Miguel. I have questions, but you wait till the end. a very interesting topic, Abya Yala. It's really interesting for me. So we'll continue with Baron. So you have the floor.
Thanks very much. I'm just going to set up this shared screen situation. All right, so firstly, I must say thank you to the organizers of this conference and the ICGSS for being a kind of constant, if distant presence in my academic life since 2016. I've learned a lot from this network, and the panels I've managed to catch up with have been really exciting. So thank you. This is like a really incredible cosmopolitan organization. The work I'm trying to talk about today is, despite the time I've spent on it, new to me. This paper is chapter 2 of my dissertation, a suitably over-ambitious project that seeks to explore the aesthetic, formal constitution of the safari. The safari is an interstice of global and local constructs, inherently of the global south. It is manufactured elsewhere in some senses. It's an incredibly profitable term in southern, eastern, and central Africa in particular. The practice of safaris sees sort of white imperialists seeking out charismatic megafauna and then natural surroundings, selling an experience of both proximity and threat, a part of the thrill of getting close to animals deemed dangerous, right? But in some sense, it's because we've forgotten how to live with lions and how to live with these charismatic megafauna, that they are in fact dangerous and that threat is marketable. These regions where you encounter these animals, protected conservation areas, these are heavily mediated spaces constructed to evacuate the presence of human life, culture, and history, to conserve animal life, entrenching the dualistic, and I'm quoting here, separation of human from non-human. This process is indelibly aesthetic, and the practices have not changed since the 19th century imperial adventurers and the great white hunters of the 20th century. I'm thinking of Hemingway and Roosevelt in Eastern Africa in particular. Going to a protected conservation area in 1999, South African writer Njabulo Ndebele described the experience as a brush with colonial leisuring, end quote, where Black labor, life, and history are erased in favor of this Edenic surrounding. And you can see in these images here, the one on the left is this sort of imperial adventurer on the back of one of his porters getting carried through a swamp. And the one on the bottom right shows a sort of Black laborer setting up a safari lunch in Kenya. But life lived with animals in proximity to these non-human agents cannot be separated as neatly as the aesthetic form imagines. To Bowdlerize Rob Nixon, there is no such thing as an eternity of bush. Finding images like the ones on the screen at the moment it's not easy. These photographs are not what we usually associate with the charismatic megafauna of southern and eastern Africa. Zebras with city skylines, lions as city skylines, these are not what we associate with the notion of the safari. The Chakama baboon in the bottom right there stealing groceries from a woman in the Western Cape is an example of a violent collision between human and non-human agents. But this violence is often part of the separation. If you're interested in finding out more about this, I cannot recommend Louise Green's book, Rockwater Life, from Wits Press in 2018. But the point I'm trying to get to is that living in proximity to non-human life is neither Edenic, nor is it the constant threat, as the safari form would kind of like us to imagine. There's a sort of complex hybridity on the go. I don't really have the time today to talk about this, but I don't want to be irresponsible and not mention it. Land politics are incredibly important when it comes to the protected conservation areas. This map, very briefly, sort of the green areas are lands evacuated of the quote modern human life in an effort to preserve an imagined project of wilderness. Maybe after the talk, there'll be some time to talk about this, because Thomas Mofolo's novel is very invested in this idea of, sort of land and the land, these kinds of different constructs. I use the term form in a particular, if idiosyncratic way, endorsed by some of the works of the new formalists like Caroline Levine, Anna Combler, Graham Riach, Tom Ayers, and some other scholars who are invested in politicizing literary forms and understanding that, first and foremost, forms organize, and organization is inherently a function of politics and political action. Forms are multiple. There are more than one at any given moment. Levine uses the example of a fork to get at a concept of affordance, so designed for eating. A fork can also be a screwdriver, it can be a weapon, it can be a bolt for a door, a child's plaything, etc., etc. The sort of uses and affordances of this form exceed the material reality of it. The point is that forms exceed and are exceeded by the material world they try to organize. So protected conservation areas seek to separate animal life from human life, but these spaces are constantly exceeding this formal structuring. Animals escape, people intrude on the fortress of conservation, and these, quote here, wildlife republics from Walter Rodney in the 1970s, these become the sites of border crossings, smuggling of extra-legal materials, and infrastructural repurposings. For example, the Kruger National Park in South Africa was intended to be a way to control the ivory trade by disarming large portions of the Tonga people in the region. But it has become an international tourist destination for people seeking to get close to wildlife. Safari form is a particular organizing pattern. The land is transformed into landscape, a product of what Atto Quayson calls colonial spacemaking, end quote, in which the colony maps its cultural, social, and political practices onto geographical spaces in an effort to replicate its own taxonomies and hierarchies. The separation and mediation of human and non-human life is a part of this organizational pattern. The form relies on the construction of an Africa writ large, outside of time, end quote. This is that quote outside of time it's from a 2023 Harper's Magazine article, but it could just as easily be Hegel, really. The word safari means to seek through journey, a word from Arab traders in the early 12th century trade routes established around the Indian Ocean world. So from the outset, the term is global in its orientation and not exclusively bound to the imperial mentality of hunter. The linguistic heritage suggests a complicated history beyond the ken of colonial reductions of discovery and the arrival of historical narrative with settler colonialism. As a result, narratives that reintroduce complexity into the binaries surrounding the taxonomies of human, non-human life offer ways to think anew the possibilities afforded by the safari form. As I see it, the safari form is constituted of four interrelated but somewhat distinct concepts: movement, encounter, taxonomy, and proximity. These four terms, when traced through literary representations of human-animal relations, offer ways to deconstruct the imperial sedimentation of this practice. This is important because it presents ways to reconceive of conservation writ large, an attempt to get away from the land-grabbing, violently preservationist, neoliberal practice of conservation as separation. This is evidenced in projects like the 30 by 30 project, which aims to have 30% of the Earth transformed into protected areas by 2030. This model doesn't work, and it only increases conflict and poverty in regions which must abide by these mandates handed down from often international governing bodies. By unpicking these terms and imagining new, more convivial modes of conservation, to borrow from Brown Buscher and the exciting Convivial Conservation Network, we can start to think of new representational engagements with the notion of the safari. This project is inherently post-colonial eco-critical because in order to think about ecological relationships seriously, we need to consider the historical representations of these relationships. So one, to quote Kirk Sides here, one cannot think the ecological imaginary without the historical representation of texts and actors. This is central to the project of postcolonial studies. I'm going to shift into the sort of second part of this presentation now, which is actually about the text, which is exciting, at least the exciting part for me. So this is Thomas Mofolo. He is a Sesotho writer from Lesotho. He died in 1948 in the shadow of the Mofolo Drakensberg. He died somewhat penniless and abandoned, but he is probably he's the first sort of Black African writer writing in English or translated into English at least. His novel Chaka is one of the first novels to be published in an African language. Um, so he's a very important writer, a kind of strange, strange kind of man of coloniality and colonialism. Like he worked at the Paris Evangelical Missionary Press, and his work, Traveller to the East, is quite is a piece of like Protestant propaganda, really, sort of expanding the values of Christianity throughout the lands. But by the time he gets to Chaka, eventually published in 1925, whilst we know the novel was completed in 1909, 1910, his politics have changed. Right? Chaka never presents a pre-colonial idyll where the worlds of humans and non-humans live in total peace. The novel is incredibly violent and it is rife with movement. King Chaka is perhaps best known as the leader of the Zulu during the period known as the Mfukani Zulu and the Tifikani Sesotho. This period saw massive Zulu expansion in the interior of southern Africa in the 18th century. The causes of this expansion range widely and wildly, from environmental collapse in the form of droughts to the power lust of the Zulu King Chaka. Slave trading in Portuguese East Africa, contemporary Mozambique, is also a major factor involved in the Mfukani Tifikani. But the internal politics and vicissitudes of leaders cannot be ignored from this historical accounting. Ultimately, the debate rages on because there's just not that much evidence. Oral traditions have been deeply disrupted by colonialism and subsequently apartheid, and the historical record is wholly unreliable in that it casts Chaka as a power-hungry tyrant, inciting cannibalism and ritual killing as a means to motivate civilizing missions into the interior. Mofolo's novel works with all of these threads in some part, but focuses on the rise and fall of Chaka. My interest in the novels was historical. There's a really important challenge to the colonial archive in Mofolo's representation of the complex cosmologies and political worlds of this imagined empty land. But I'm also interested in the representations of human and non-human life in the novel, which often relies on metaphorical allusions to humans becoming animals and animals becoming humans. Human and animal life live in close proximity to one another in the novel. There's a cluster of forms structuring these relationships. The cultural practice of life and its predators and life and its humans are represented in the novel through metaphors and songs. It's understood that a hyena will take and eat people because the hyena has agency in the space that needs to be accounted for. Songs about the hyena suggest that they hunt at night because they're guilty of being seen during the daylight. There's the quote on the screen is what a person would yell out if a hyena took you from your house at night. It's picking me up. It's putting me down. It's picking me up again. It's putting me down. Now it's eating me. The idea is to yell out for help. Mofolo is at great pains to say how no one comes to help you. When Chaka's mother Nandi is exiled from King Senzangahona's court, when the king has more male heirs and the other wives turn against her, she transforms from a lioness to a dog who arrived already pregnant, suggesting a kind of taxonomy of relation. Chaka remains the nursling of a wild beast, a newborn little lion who is then compared to a lion and then who goes on to cause or goes on to incite great violence. One of Chaka's generals, Ndlebe, is repeatedly described as a dog. In a battle that Chaka wins because of Ndlebe's powers of hearing, hunting, and his desire to please Chaka, he's described as follows. Covered with mud like a dog that had been running hard, his dangling tufts of hair swept backwards and hanging at the back of his head. He was as alert as a dog which had picked up the scent of an animal. His mouth was open, and he was breathing exactly like a dog. This repetition is a constant feature of Mofolo's style, and Ndlebe in particular comes to take on these animal attributes. a certain point, he's described, like Chaka describes, looking into his eyes and not seeing any humanity there, seeing the pretense of humanism. Oh, sorry, not humanism, seeing the pretense of a human being in his eyes. The illusion and the metaphor of this language does not diminish this transformation. I don't mean to suggest that this is mere metaphor. Metaphor itself is very powerful, and Leve is a dog in these contexts. Chaka becomes so powerful and indestructible in battle that he turns on his own people in the novel to satiate his bloodlust. The hubristic fall of the powerful leader is attributed to his transformation into a beast-like being whose human nature died totally and irretrievably. This is where I see Mofolo's critique of power and the imagined Edenic pastoral idol of life with non-human agents in the pre-colonial era. When two of Chaka's soldiers, men who are sent on suicide mission because of the king's jealousy, are returning against all odds, they were so emaciated that many who had known them as they had been before would never have recognized them now. Indeed, so wasted were they that even the animals of the veldt did not take any notice of them. A lion would come and sniff at them and then pass on unconcerned. The hyena would also sniff at them and go its way. The predators of the veldt ignore these emaciated men because they are, quote, mere skeletons, not worth the effort. But when these men return, they are killed by Chaka, and the man who garnered the king's jealousies yells out that, and I quote here, "Many people believe that you are not a human being resembling other people. And today I am convinced this is true," end quote. The tension here is that these men find mercy, perhaps apathy rather, in the wilderness from the beasts deployed throughout the work to illustrate violence and murder, yet find death when returning to the realm of humans and Chaka's control. I see this as a sort of version of what Kajitani Iheka calls strategic anthropocentrism. The critique of power Mofolo as leveling in Chaka relies on the proximity of different worldviews. The non-human agent has alternate drives and desires to the world of the human, and all claims to separateness. Rationality, compassion, clemency, etc., that humans often deploy to claim not only differences, but ascendancy, are shown to be totally imaginary. Kajitani Iheka in Naturalizing Africa describes a notion of strategic anthropocentrism to bring to the fore ecological awareness. But what's happening in Chaka is not about ecological restoration. Instead, the novel stresses the diffuseness of human agency to claims of superiority, and in so doing challenges colonial taxonomies of life and linear narratives about big man historical agents like Chaka, favored by the colonial archive. By stressing the interrelations of non-human life, Mofolo's novel collapses distinctions between human and animal life. The import of this deconstruction denies colonial narratives totalizing domination and agency in the interior of Southern Africa. Contextually, Mofolo's novel is written during the process of unification in South Africa. The organization of the 4 colonies into the Republic of South Africa in 1910 began the process of entrenching boundaries and borders and claimed status for a land. Turning the colonies into a nation freezes the land, right? That was, in fact, vibrant and motile. Mofolo's stress on human, non-human interactions wades into this context by illustrating the long history of movement, encounter, and proximal life in South Africa. Lastly, the safari needs to be reconsidered. The entrenchment of colonial desiring and colonial leisuring here has become a neoliberal force co-opted by green colonialisms that deny indigenous conservation practices that are often more convivial, if not entirely peaceful, right? By re-engaging with canonical post-colonial literary representations, emphasizing in their work on non-human human life, the sedimented safari, which depicts a human agent moving through landscapes seeking animals out, can begin to be thought anew. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baron. So we have the time to discuss about the safari form and the novel of Mofolo. I'm trying to connect with the presentation of Miguel about the land. So I find it, for me, it's really interesting because I'm also interested with the land, but in another sense. So Irene, we now listen to your talk.
Thank you. I will now share my screen. So can you all see it? Okay, so my talk is Embodying New Narratives, so creative ways for mindful connection in a complex environment. And I would like to thank my colleague Angela Faiella and Giovanni Emanuele Corazza, which is the coordinator of Marconi Institute for Creativity. So, okay, Marconi Institute for Creativity is based in Bologna, and I'm a research collaborator. The Institute focuses on research activities, education, and applied projects related to creativity from various disciplinary perspectives. And my research domain is in future studies and strategic foresight, often shortened to futures and foresight. And I will briefly explain it for clarity. Future studies can be understood as the science of possible futures, comprising theoretical frameworks and practical applications. It includes three levels, so forecasting, foresight, and anticipation, quoting Giovanni Emanuele Corazza in Handbook of Anticipation. To be more practical, a typical foresight process begins with defining a topic and a time horizon, which can be, for example, the future of the meat industry in 2040, or the future of a geographical region in 2035, so long periods of time. And this process is mostly collaborative and involves a diverse group with different areas of expertise. So we collect driving forces, so signals of the present that can help us understand how the future might evolve. And these forces are analyzed, and we use a steep framework, so social, technological, ecological, economic, and political, to gain a comprehensive overview of these signals that can inform us about potential futures. Once we have gathered these signals, we interpret these forces through various methodologies, futures and foresight methodologies, focusing on those that carry the greatest uncertainty and the greatest potential impact. So what is interesting for us is that the process ultimately results in a short narratives of different plausible scenarios, different plausible futures, usually from 2 to 4, and also more, but mostly 4. And these scenarios of the future are used to test existing strategies, for example, in a business, or evaluate opportunities for innovation, and maybe anticipate potential policies. Sorry, English is not my native language. So how does this differ from, let's say, conventional strategic planning? Forecast is quantitative, so we take data and we project them in the future, but the future we can stretch is short to medium, so 3 to 5 years. This is the common way of strategizing in businesses. But with foresight, we can focus on a long-term period, so 5 to 20 plus years, and it's a long-term vision, and it's based on qualitative data, let's say, or projection, because we don't have evidences about the future. So it's long-term, and we talk about different futures. Sorry, problem with the slides. Okay, so the future envisioned through traditional forecasting is explained as business as usual. So it's just stretching the present, as I said, but as the world becomes more complex and uncertain, and as technological advancement accelerate, envisioning multiple futures help us prepare for sudden changes. So in Foresight, we primarily focus on plausible futures and sometimes on desirable ones for the community we work with. So this is the depiction of this cone of possibilities theorized by Boros. But the entangled time tree is an alternative representation of futures, which considers also the colonial perspective on time. So the future, the Western conception of time goes from left to right, but this representation takes also into account the past and the present as intertwined. So this concept envisions time as a baobab tree. So the deep roots signify ancestral knowledge and acknowledge also lost or erased wisdom and distorted fruits from the past. And from this past and present shape multiple present and potential futures. So this model, which is a bit more complicated but more interesting than the previous one, features three interpretations of future spaces. So a circular one. So the yellow one returns to its origins, forming an infinity loop with past. So there's this correlation between future and past. And then a path, the red one, inspired by the Sankofa icon, which emphasizes learning from the past to navigate the future. And then the blue one, which is more related to this projection in the future that goes from left to right, but expands beyond projected timelines. And it's more similar to the vision we have seen before, the cone. So also historically marginalized form of knowledge, such as animism, prophecy, dreams, collective singing, oral storytelling, are crucial to envision futures, but these have often been suppressed or dismissed as inferior knowledge forms, and this model gives them justice. So scenario exploration is what we have seen before, so is widely used in strategic context and involves identifying trends and uncertainties and constructing a series of possible scenarios, and helps also to counteract common decision-making errors. Futures literacy is another concept which is more, allow me to say, democratic, and involves the ability to imagine the future and harness the power of these images of the future. So human can develop this literacy, but the obstacle we usually face are a present bias, so a tendency to prioritize short-term rewards over long-term gains, or temporal alienation. So we are too used to focus on the next election, on the next season. So we are not very trained to think long-term, and futures literacy and foresight processes help people to do that, to stretch the view to the future. Creativity, of course, can be a huge help to imaging futures, and can help the futurists in the application of foresight methodologies and the dynamic nature of creativity, and the different phases of the creative process are effectively summarized in the Da Vinci method here portrayed. And I can further explain it later, but I will go further. And another concept that talks about creativity, another framework theorized by Professor Corazza, is the dynamic universal creativity process, and describes the active sum of all creativity episodes in the cosmos evolution. So including non-human creativity and now also artificial creativity. So the UCP can catalyze innovation across different layers of existence, and these phases are temporal in a temporal fashion, but also recursive, so they can influence each other. And in the present, we have all these layers of creativity. So we have the biological one, the social, psychosocial one, and also the artificial one. So we have to deal with all of them. So why anticipating this uncertain environment? Anticipating different scenarios is crucial in today's environment because we face different polycrises. So figuring the future as a simple extension of the present is no longer viable. The power of narratives is also a topic explored in Image of the Future by Fred Pollack. This is a book of 1961 and describes man's creative ability for imagining the future, which shapes the dynamics of the historical process. So he says the growth or decline of the images of the future often precedes the rise or fall of the Western civilizations. So also from a religious point of view, the image of the future are also how they change, influence how the culture, the civilization might fall or rise. So more going to the second part of the presentation, science fiction, as we know it, has always influenced research on human-computer interaction, but inspirations come mostly from global north. I said Western, but it's more from the global north mainstream images of the future, where nature is poorly considered. So, or it's part of it's part of the discourse, but very marginal. But luckily, more narratives are emerging. So, like movements like Afrofuturism, indigenous futures, or solar punk take into account also a vision of nature which is positively integrated with humanity and also technology. So Black Panther might be the most famous example, but there are many of these narratives that challenge the colonizing of futures imaginary of the images of the future. So, and also they explain the consequences of the lack of harmony with nature, which is very interesting. So an interesting paper from 2018 shows how we are shifting from earthlessness to also bodilessness. So we have to take care of our relationship with technology and our body and the nature. So these things are interrelated, and technology is not automatically positive. And I wrote down this quote because I think it's very interesting. So since the imagining imagining possibility was once left to the gods, but since the Enlightenment, imagining has been transferred from gods to humans, so humanism. And for Harari, in this digital third industrial revolution, imagining, so having authority and control over knowledge production, is now being transferred to data. So we are in a third phase of dataism. And so my question is, can we talk about human augmentation, which is a common term to use with technology, if we are losing our ability to be fully present and to nurture our relationship with nature and biological rhythms? In foresight practices, we usually write down scenarios. These short narratives are written or illustrated, but I explored how embodied practices like drama methods or improvisation can really help people to immerse themselves in the future explored. So there's also a component of emotion, which is very important to help these processes. And also there are processes that explore their relationship with nature. and is mostly done in processes that are about a territory. But I think it would be interesting to include a priori nature in the discourse when designing collaborative processes. And here I put two examples. One is a workshop I participated to, and the other one is based in Taiwan. So putting nature in the design is something which is very powerful. And an intervention by Julia von Tienen, the Marconi Institute for Creativity conference, was talking about AI enhanced co-creativity, so introducing nature's voice during creative teamwork in sustainable design hubs. So this idea of including nature in the design of things, of processes, or in collaborative settings, and also in offices as an important part of the design of the spaces, is a discourse which is open, and I think it's crucial in this moment in which we face a climate crisis. So conclusions, I talked about many things, but I think they are interrelated. A diffusion of diverse narratives of the future can contribute to questioning and reframing actions in the present, because future serves us to think about what we want to do in the present. And the corporeality dialogue with nature should not be overlooked in collaborative settings. And the different levels we have seen of the UCP, so this non-human creativity, human and non-human creativity, can be of inspiration for comprehensive models of facilitation in futures and foresight and beyond. So thank you very much. And I would also like to thank all the people I talked to about this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene, for the presentation. It's more technical than speaking. I mean, for me, who is a literary critic, of course, I'm interested also on the topic of future. And so I have, nevertheless, some questions. So we are done with the presentation. So we take the questions. I've seen no hand raised yet. So I will maybe go directly to my questions. And of course, you could also feel free to ask questions to the other panelists. I would like to start with Miguel. So if I understood your approach, you were presenting the way a specific magazine speaks about Abya Yala. So, but I was wondering. The first one is a very simple question. I was wondering if it's the only how do you say in English? The only in French we say numéro of this issue. Yes, the only issue. Is it the only issue to talk about Abya Yala in Mexico, or is it, what makes it specific? Because it seems to me that Abya Yala is becoming a popular concept. And why is it important to speak about the way the magazine presented it? Is there any, let's say, revolution in that sense by taking this topic? So that's the first question I have for you. But another one is also that you presented Abya Yala as a community. And of course, my source could be incomplete, but there is a dictionary from a woman called Françoise Claudia Bourguignon-Rougier, who she dedicated a whole website as a dictionary for the decolonial dictionary. And one of the concepts she talks about is the concept of Abya Yala. And it's appeared that Abya Yala is the way the Kuna of Panama called the earth. And it's literally means, the way she said, means the living earth, or the earth of life, or the growth earth, or the blood earth, or the earth of the blood, the blood. And you were talking about it as a community located in a specific region, or we can locate it in a specific region. So I just want to understand if Abya Yala is a concept, or it refers to a specific community, or if it's a decolonial concept, which is also criticized by some who say it's a way to bring us back to the past instead of facing the current problems. So I'll start with Miguel and follow up.
Okay, thanks. First, I want to say that the magazine of the University of Mexico is the only one I can remember that trade that concept, Abya Yala. There is in Mexico some magazines, some cultural magazines, but there are only culture and literally magazines. So the content of these magazines don't take this kind of topics. So the magazine of the University of Mexico with this dossier make a change, is doing a change of what we can approach to some topics. So first is the only magazine that I remember that take this item and trade on his pages. So that's the first question that you make me. So the second question, Abya Yala is taken in this magazine like concept, the concern, all there is an alternative way of referring the American continent. So in the base of the term is only a region of Panama, like you say. The term now in America is to name all the region and all the these indigenous lands. So there are some changes that allow us to see all this territory. So there is a debate in Latin America about some terms. For example, indigenous is not the most occupied term. We're going to occupy the origin lands, for example, or origin inhabitants. So when we talk about this, we are in a trouble because there is not a only concept. So Abya Yala is the new way to contemplate all the region. I don't know sincerely if there is a colonialism term that see Abya Yala like that, but it's a popular way to see all this region, and so is the way the magazine take this concept. I don't know if I am clearly about that.
Yes, of course, you present it like it appears like dedicating an issue on this topic is an epistemic turn, like we want to put the emphasis on this topic. And yes, you're right to mention that Abya Yala is one of the new name, let's say you say the original nations or the population of Latin America decided to call the continent Abya Yala. And it's really this link to the earth, like calling the earth Mother Earth, not a place you have to dominate and exploit, and that's bring me to Baron with this safari. So it's really the way you present. I mean, it's another way of showing how coloniality is almost everywhere, and it's still there are still safaris. People still go there, and it's crazy. So, and this way of looking at a place like a place to dominate, organize a place to dominate not only the nature but also human beings, where when the people there are forced, not forced, but serve those who come. But now I have two questions. The first one is about land and the land. You didn't take enough time to explain to us what's the difference between land with minor, I don't know how to call it, and the land with capital A. So that's the first question, maybe a clarification. And the second one is about Thomas Molofo's Chaka. It's looked like Molofo's, so it sounds a little bit paradoxical, like it seems like the whites or the colonizers were not the first to bring this distinction between the human and the nature, because if Chaka was already treating others like and becoming a beast, losing all his humanity, it sounds like the nature was seen before as a threat, not really this harmony we have in the Abya Yala concept, where the human being is in harmony with the nature. I don't know if it was intentional to present it that way, or because if it's that way, I don't really see the critique of the safari. It's like the safari forms still were there before even the practice of the colonial safari began. I don't know if my question is clear. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's really helpful. I think like you're actually you're being very generous about this reading. Like I don't know if I was saying anything as expansive as that. Like I was trying to say something much smaller, but I think maybe I missed it. But I'll go to the second one first, and then I'll come back to the question of land, because I think the first one's ultimately bizarrely a little simpler than the second one. The second one, I think like what I was trying to show first and foremost is like the idea that such a space as wilderness exists is a construct of the safari form. You know, the sort of images of the zebras and the like cityscapes in the background, that's from Rwanda. And the idea that there are no humans in this wilderness, it's just animal life that exists there. It's like a total myth, right? And this is a big part of like how Africa is constructed in the colonial imaginary, that it's like this wild land dominated by beasts, and there are no people, there's no history, there's no culture, there's none of that. So this work I'm trying to do with Mofolo is to show that actually, no, there's lots of people in these spaces, there's lots of movement, there's lots of politics, but it isn't this Edenic, peaceful, noble relationship with animals where, the hyena's coming to eat meat out of your hand, and like this, this kind of situation. It's like, actually, no, these are agents, and they have different desires, they have different sort of worlds, really, and they collide. A hyena will eat you if you come across it, and this is like, something that you need to figure out how to live with, or live amongst, or live amidst. And I think it's an important part of the sort of human non-human that gets a little sidelined in view of the larger political project, which is to deconstruct this. It's like, well, there is violence that exists between human and animal life, and how do we account for that? And I think that Mofolo's representation of this takes back some of those colonial narratives of this paradigmatic, Edenic, idle, pastoral space where, the sort of noble savages, comfortably associates with animal life every day. It's like, it's not a big deal. In fact, actually, it was, there are like collisions that take place. So that's what I was trying to stress there. And I think like the idea that Chaka loses his humanity, becomes beast-like, is where Mofolo is critiquing this idea of critiquing power and seeking domination. And I don't think I set that up like incredibly well in the presentation. Is that this is ultimately a sort of tale of hubris, right? Like Chaka chases down total domination of this land, builds this enormous empire, and as a result, kind of becomes a little bit imperial in that space. There's an interesting historical narrative published in the 1960s that thinks of Shaka Zulu as Africa's Napoleon, and it's like, instead of seeing him as like this sort of bloodthirsty tyrant, you've now got to think of him as like Emperor Napoleon, right? And all the kinds of complexities that go with that. As to the first question, the land and the land, the sort of lowercase land and the big symbolic land, it's like this is borrowed from Sean Graham, and the idea is like they're really like land becomes symbolically resonant when it becomes invested with cultural meaning, but in the colonial era it becomes sort of fetishized and transformed into extractable resources in some senses, which, yeah, I mean, I have questions for the other panelists as well, but that was great. Thank you very much. I hope that
helped. Okay, thank you very much. So I wanted to ask you a question related to what you said. So would you say that the safari is a way of start with this idea of the Edenic Africa? So a place, because Molofo shows it's not a place where human beings live with animals in, and the safari is also maybe based on this utopia, this place where you can go near to animals, and is there also this idea of utopia?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. That it's like outside of modern life, it's separate, it's where you can escape to, you can unplug, all these kinds of ideas, right? This is part of the constellation I see as like organizing this form.
Kind of self elevation also.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just asked the last question to Irene, and then I'll let you, because Baron also have questions for other panelists. So Irene, thank you very much, because I was always wondering, in fact, we have this future sciences, this institute of the future. Even in Africa, we have now Institute for the Future, where people think about how could we this country or the continent could be in the next years. And even you have these programs, the United Nations have programs.
Yeah.
And now they say Africa is in 2050 will be I don't know how to explain it in English. So it will be the place to be.
Mm-hmm.
It will be the place to be. It will be the youngest continent. I don't know, but what you mentioned is these images, these mainstream images of the future are coming from the global north. And the alternative narratives you mentioned also,
Mm-hmm.
for me, it seems also that they are affected with the global north, the mainstream images. For example, Black Panther.
Yeah.
But Black Panther is a pure mainstream image of Africa. It's not an African image of the future, of his own future, but Hollywood image of the future of Africa. So my question is, what material do you use? So it is, I could put it in different way. The first one is, are you trying to imagine a global future or only a local future? In the sense, in the case you try to imagine the future of other places than the local, are you taking into account the narratives of the people of that places, what they think about the future? Because they also have a concept of the future, even though it's not the same concept of the one we all know with Iron Man flying in the air or going to the planet Mars. Yeah. So
well, first of all, I want to thank you for this question, because it makes me think a clarification is needed. So when we work with futures and foresight processes, we work with the communities or the business, or but mostly I mostly work with the communities. So it's the future for the community, imagined by the community. And about African futures, I suggest to the listeners and to you to check out NGFP Digital African Futures. I think it's the correct name, but it's made by young futurists from Africa, and it's very interesting. And those are futures from Africans for Africa, and they are clearly linked to all the programs you have talked about. You're right, Black Panthers might not be the best example because it's very westernized, but it's the most common one when we think here in the from the observatory I have. And I don't think it's the most correct one for portraying futures for Africa, also because there are lots of issues and which have been discussed. But Afrofuturism expands way more from this representation, and and also I want to thank for the clarification about the term indigenous, because it's right, we can't say just indigenous and comprehend all the all the indigenous knowledge or narratives with just one term, because there are different regions. And this is a super interesting point to take care of. And I know I have lots of biases, but it's very interesting to talk about it. So to sum up, when we work with futures and foresight processes with communities, we talk about their future. And this is a sort of reference for the actions they want to start in the present to arrive to the desired future they want. So it's a very powerful process. futures from the narratives from fictions are not part of a futures and foresight process, but they influence people at a more cultural level. So it's something we cannot overlook. We have to take into consideration which images are given to the people from the media, because they influence how we see technology, how we see society, images of the future. And yeah, narratives are not neutral as we may think. This was my my point about it. So thank you for this question.
Thank you very much, Irene. I mean, there is a lot to say about this panel. But,
Baron, I get it.
Baron, you can ask the question, and maybe if Miguel has a question, he could also ask, and Irene also.
Yeah, I mean, I just very quickly, Miguel, thank you so much. That was so interesting, and you too, Irene. That was incredibly interesting. But Miguel, I just had a very simple question, which is I just wanted to know the magazine, is it funded by the University of Mexico, or is it funded from elsewhere? Because I know a lot of literary magazines in South Africa start there and then they leave and they get published from sort of the global north, but like back down into the south. And I was kind of curious about this this publication in particular, so long.
Yes, thanks. The magazine is a product of the university. So you can find in the university, but in the libraries out of the university too. And there is a website of the magazine. There is the magazine. Some issues are in English and in Spanish, and this completely free, the magazine. So in this almost century that the magazine has published, it changed the objectives of the magazine. First, it's only I don't know how to say an organism from it's a place to show the activities of the university, but after it transformed in a literary magazine. So it's a very special magazine because treat a lot of issues, topics. Some ones are of the university, and I'm back for explain. In the last direction of Guadalupe Netel that I mentioned, it is only a social and political magazine that not treat the topics of the university. But when it changed the direction, it back to some themes of the university. It's a constantly change the way that it's flow the university topics. Sorry, I'm.
Oh, no, that's great. Thank you. That's very interesting. From trade magazine to literary magazine. It's kind of cool. It's interesting.
And maybe could you write the name of or share the link in the chat?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So is there any other question or remark? Yes, okay, it's already 19:30, and of course thank you very much. So Miguel sent the link. So as I said, your topics interest me highly, so I hope we stay in contact and continue the discussion, even though the panel has to stop. So thank you very much for both of you for sharing your research and your knowledge. and thank you for the answers you gave for the question I've asked. So we close the last panel of the day, and we prepare for tomorrow 2 p.m. for the continuation of the forum. So thank you very much. And